With all of the main components now in, it's time to connect them all up. The hoses I'm going to be using are an aircon grade rubber flexi type, the sort of thing you'd see on an OEM vehicle under the bonnet. There are two sizes, one for the high pressure and one for the low pressure side. The kit came with 5 metres of each, which I don't think will be long enough, but I can always extend them if I need to. The holes I'm drilling here are slightly larger than the hoses themselves, as I need to allow space for a rubber grommet. Now, I looked at a few options for routing, but in the end decided to run along one of the lateral cross members over to the passenger side and hug the outer face of the main chassis rail. It's at this point I can confess that, with hindsight, I think I made the wrong call on this next bit. These outriggers already came with a nice large pressed hole from the factory, but in my ultimate wisdom I decided to... Yeah, I think that was a mistake. I should have just run them through the large holes and made a few brackets to support them along the way. But what's done is done, so I'll just have to go with it. So, with the route worked out, I can get cracking. As I suspected, the hoses came up a fair bit short, so I've extended them using these inline couplers. From there they carry on into the box section above the jacking point, which admittedly could do with replacing, but we'll gloss over that because that's boring. They then pop out on the inside of the chassis rail, and from there it's straight on up into the engine bay. The only other component to fit is the receiver dryer. This has a desiccant inside which is designed to help remove moisture, and it also has a pressure switch which acts as a safety switch, the idea being if the system pressure drops below a certain level then the compressor will shut off. It comes with its own bracket, and there's even a hole already in the van structure, so that's a bonus. In theory this is a service item, and they do have a usable lifespan, so it wants to be fairly accessible for future maintenance. They also say to avoid close proximity to high heat areas like the exhaust manifold for example. Where I've got it here next to the radiators should be pretty good. So it comes up from under the chassis and towards the compressor. From there it goes all the way down to the condenser rad. And then from the condenser onto the receiver dryer and back down the chassis to the evaporator unit inside. One thing that did concern me was the charge points, as these are located on the compressor fittings which are now pretty inaccessible, so I've added an inline point on one side and another one on one of the receiver dryer fittings. Now that I'm happy with the run, I need to strip it all out and have the ends crimped. Right, I'll go and get those crimped. I went to the local hydraulic shop for this, and although the guy wasn't too familiar with aircon stuff, he was happy enough to give it a go. I'm not sure if the dies were quite right, as some of the ferrules kinked up a bit, but it's all pretty low pressure stuff here, especially compared to the hydraulic ones, so it should all be fine. I find it's the little things that make a job like this, and protecting bare edges is so important on stuff like this, so I'm using a thick wax oil coating before I fit the grommets. I'll do the same for the tech screws on the clamps as well, as they're equally vulnerable. And you've seen the rest of the install already pretty much, so I won't bore you with any more of that. Back in the engine bay then, and the compressor fittings need their own seals which come in the kit. It's at this point you can see why marking the orientation of the ends before crimping them is so important. There's basically no adjustment to be had if you need to rotate it, so getting it right beforehand is critical. These fittings are the pad mount type as opposed to the screw version. Essentially they're just a press fit with an O-ring to seal, and they have a clamping plate above with a 10mm bolt holding it down. All the rest in this kit are the screw-on type. I couldn't find any torque figures for these, but you kind of get a feel for them really, and these ones felt pretty solid, so I did them up pretty tightly. The bracket mount could have been a bit stronger, but once it's all tight and in, then it was fine. One thing I did like was the fittings came with the screw-in blanks, which saved having to tape up the ends. This was one of the harder ones, as the angle was critical for the thread to start, but in the end it was alright. I thought I might have to take the bumper off to tighten it, but luckily the spanner ended up at pretty much the perfect angle. This one was a bit weaker, so I had to brace it with another spanner. And last up, at least in the engine bay, is the final compressor fitting. After that, it's pretty much just a whole load of wiring. Oh, and I will get round to fitting that new belt, I promise.